Welcome to Sons of Patriarchy. I'm your host, Peter Bell. Sons of Patriarchy exists to expose the hidden power structures behind Christian nationalism. Through survivor testimonies, shared storytelling, and honest expert critiques from across the political, theological, and cultural spectrums, we shine light on systems of abuse and authoritarian control principally focused on Doug Wilson of Moscow, Idaho, and the movements he has founded and influenced, as well as across Reformed and conservative churches. Our goal is not just to inform, how did we get here, and what do we do about it, but to spark meaningful conversations in homes, faith communities, and public spaces about what a healthier, freer, and more just society can look like. Together, we can dismantle harmful narratives and build communities of mutual respect and diversity. Sons of Patriarchy aims to do what Doug cannot. We will unite people. We do not demand you be like us. We meet you where you are. And while you may not always agree with us, we hope we can agree on this. Churches should be safe. You can find us on all podcasting platforms as well as YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and X, and sonsofpatriarchy.com. Ad-free episodes, bonus content, listening a week ahead of time on both audio and video, monthly Ask Us Anything specials, and many more perks are available across 5 membership levels at patreon.com/sonsofpatriarchy. Much of the same is available via Apple Podcast subscriptions for $4.99 a month. You can give to this work directly at donorbox.com/sons-of-patriarchy. Exclusive Sons of Patriarchy merch is available at sonsofpatriarchy.com/merch. If you'd like to get a hold of us, desire to interview either myself or co-producer Sarah Bader, or you're a news media agency looking for information on Christian nationalism, patriarchy, Doug Wilson, or anything else we covered in the series, go to sonsofpatriarchy.com/contact. Now, on to the episode. Thank you for being here with us today. In today's episode, we'd like to extend a special shout out to Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew, dedicated to helping lay people in the PCA to understand PCA church government and process and to follow PCA business, especially related to caring for victims of abuse. A link to their group is in our show notes. Welcome to Excommunicated, Abuse in the PCA, Part 1. In this episode, we'll speak with Joyce Rowe, a former member of Rio Vista Community Church, a PCA in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, Lynna Sutherland, the founder of Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew, and Lynna's mother, Donna Westcott, a licensed professional counselor who writes at donnawestcott.com, which will also be in our show notes. Joyce tells the story of marital abuse and neglect and her desire to bring it to her pastors for help, for counsel, and for guidance. Instead, she was put under the microscope while her husband was good to go. She was disciplined, barred from the Lord's Supper, which is the step right before excommunication, without a trial, without investigation, and without due process. She wanted repentance from her husband, help, and a listening ear. Her church wanted to keep things quiet. Presbyterianism works until it doesn't. It is rightly lauded for its systems of accountability and structure of church government. Ministers to be held accountable to their presbyteries, with any deviation from Christian orthodoxy to be examined. But sometimes, and it can feel like it happens a lot more often than not, the very systems set in place don't feel like they hold ministers accountable for their actions or decisions. As you'll hear in Joyce's story, and many more to come, it can be used as a way for ministers to keep their buddies in the system, and the agitators, read, those who come with accusations of abuse, out. So, we begin with our first story in the PCA.
Sure. So my name is Joyce Rowe. I'm from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and the church I was a part of was Rio Vista Community Church. As far as how I entered the Reformed world, I was raised in the Southern Baptist Church, mostly by a Southern Baptist mom. My dad was relatively non-religious. And I came up, just believing the Bible, and I was definitely got some purity culture in there, where when I came to the time that I was dating and thinking about who I was going to marry, the forefront of my mind was I wanted to marry the one that loved Jesus the most, because that's what you're taught in purity culture. It's like, it doesn't matter, about if you're really all that compatible. It's really about, do you love Jesus? Does he love Jesus? Well, if you both love Jesus, you're going to have a great marriage together. So I met my now ex-husband, and at the time he was attending a Reformed Baptist church. And on our very first date, he gave me a rundown of the 5 points of Calvinism. And I remember at the time thinking that it was heretical. Like, I was immediately turned off to it. But he said to me, well, go home and read Romans 9. And because I was, again, a little Bible-believing Southern Baptist girl, I never even heard of Calvinism or Arminianism at this point. And I went home and I read Romans 9, and I was like, okay, there it is. There's election. Okay, I guess he's right. And so he ended up being seen to me as he had gone to Bible college. He was well-read. He had all of this knowledge. And here he was teaching me, even though I'd been a Christian my whole life, teaching me new things about the Bible that I hadn't seen or known at that point. And so I saw him as being this spiritual leader and, someone I admired and respected for their faith. So we got married relatively quickly. And we started attending the Reformed Baptist Church where he was a member at that time. And that church was extremely strict. They were highly Sabbatarian. You weren't only were you not supposed to work on Sunday, but you were not supposed to cause anyone else to work on Sunday. Mm-hmm. So like things within the congregation, like they wouldn't invite you out to eat after church because going out to a restaurant would have been bad. So people very frequently would come over to each other's homes after church because we weren't allowed to go out to eat. So we'd visit each other after church. Church attendance was a requirement of membership, that you had to attend the morning service, the evening service, and the Wednesday night prayer meeting. And if you didn't attend, it was very clear you were not making the cut. And so it was a very rigid atmosphere that I was first brought into the Reformed Church. We were only at that church for about a year and a half. And after that, we changed our view on infant baptism. And so then at that point, my then husband was like, well, at this point, we're Presbyterians then if we've changed our view on baptism. So why don't we just go to a Presbyterian church? And so we started looking at churches in our area. And Rio was the one that kind of stood out to us. And it was really exciting to me to be at Rio because the church was such a much more relaxed atmosphere than I had been used to within the Reformed Baptist world. Rio felt more like an evangelical, non-denom, like the kind of church that I was accustomed to. And then it was sometime during the time we started attending Rio that my husband started reading Doug Wilson. And he would always talk to me kind of vaguely about what he was reading. And I remember upon the first time him telling me about Doug and about how Doug curses, and he had written this book about slavery and another book about a blow-up doll. And I just remember thinking, like, this doesn't sound like behavior that would be desirable behavior for a pastor. And when I kind of questioned him on it, he was very quick to kind of jump in and defend Doug. And he was like, oh, yeah, well, a lot of people say that, but, it was kind of like he's pushing against the culture. And, yeah, he curses, but, Paul said scubala. And, there were all these, references to, or I think the raka also in the scriptures. So there were references to times where in the scriptures it seemed like somebody may have cussed and it was acceptable because of what they were trying to express. And so, I just kind of let it play in the background. I was not interested in Doug, but my husband was reading him, and I started to see a change, kind of in my husband, in his desire for authority, I guess. He became very focused on what makes a man, what a manly man is, what a masculine man is. And I mean, I think he always struggled with feeling confident in himself. And Doug kind of gave the projection of the confident man that I think my ex wanted to be.
So on to this this PCA church, which is, it's interesting that you say it was less strict than the church that you've been to before, the Reformed Baptist Church, because we're starting to hear that trend on Sons of Patriarchy, where people come from dominantly purity culture or very strict churches, and so they go to a CREC, they go to a Reformed church, Nate Park church, and they can start drinking, they can start going out, they can start having fun, and so it feels, at least the front end, it feels freer, more liberty, more communal, less rule oriented. So it's interesting that you talk about that, because we've heard that a lot. So more to the PCA church, because this plays a big part in your story as well as your husband. What was the culture like at this PCA? Because it never starts as like a horrible place that you don't want to be in. It starts as a place with a bunch of people that you enjoy. So what was that like?
Yeah. When we first arrived at Rio, like I said, it was way more casual than I was used to. At the Reformed Baptist Church we were at prior, they were very stoic in their worship. It was strictly hymns, and only a piano was allowed. And I was a singer, so it was kind of sad for me that I didn't feel like I had a place to use my gifts in that church. So when I came to Rio and they had a worship team, I was able to join the worship team and get involved in that way. They had a small group. They called them community groups, and they were always looking for small group leaders. So I volunteered my ex-husband in my house as a place where they could hold small group, and it was just very welcoming, very warming. We had a special needs child. He was about 4 at the time, and he was nonverbal autistic. And when I first came to Rio, within just a few weeks, they were asking us, like, what can we do? How can we help? And they met our insurance deductible the following year. When I got pregnant with another baby, the women of the church did a diaper drive and a wipes drive for me. And I had so many diapers and wipes that I didn't buy diapers for the whole first year. And it was really welcoming. I had had a hard time breastfeeding my first 2 children. When I had my third, they hired a lactation consultant for me. I mean, it was above and beyond the things that you would expect from a church. And so I really felt like, wow, we have found that Acts 2 church where everybody helps each other. And I was just so proud to be a part of it. I really loved the church, and I felt, but I will say that it is, the casual atmosphere was very surprising in a couple of ways. First of all, the name of the church does not have the word Presbyterian anywhere in the name.
Mhm.
And what I realized was there was a very large percentage of the congregation who did not even know it was a Presbyterian church. And then there was another time where I was talking to one of the deacons and I mentioned the acronym TULIP.
Mhm.
And he didn't know what I was talking about. And I remember thinking, wow, that's strange. He's a deacon and he doesn't know what TULIP is or what the Voice of Calvinism is. So it didn't feel like this highly stoic theological congregation.
Hmm.
Did I answer the question?
Yeah, you did. Yeah. So being at this, and this is, and we're not saying, I don't want to be careful. We're not saying every congregation or church that is extraordinarily helpful and communal on the front end is going to bite you in the butt in the back end.
No, absolutely not.
But it does put this into perspective. They don't come right out and say like, we're this nasty place that's going to accuse you of things or is not going to come around you. So you've left that church. If people are listening to you, it's not because you're still there and having a grand old time. It's because you left because something happened to you. When did you start questioning? Because it started off great. What happened to make you question something at this church?
Well, honestly, all I can say is I got disciplined, and that's what happened. I long story. I'm going to try to be concise. It's a long story, but in 2021, my marriage was just hitting a really bad spot. I started seeing counselors because my health was being affected. And so I went to the church. I sent them a very detailed letter about the behavior of my husband in my marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And they wrote back and agreed with me that it was terrible and egregious. And they said, and at this point, I was not comfortable. I would say I was just getting used to hearing it described as abuse to my own ears. So I wasn't real comfortable using the word abuse. And I think, I don't know if that would have made a difference or not. But I did tell them that I felt like I had been sexually abused in my marriage. And I gave very, very explicit detail. And they agreed that it was bad. But they were very reluctant to call it abusive. And I think that maybe there's a part of me that's like, was it my own reluctance that made them reluctant? I don't really think so, though. I think, yeah, so I didn't really question the church until after I went through the discipline process with them. My marriage had gotten really abusive, mostly sexually, also just abandonment issues. My ex was very not involved with the home or the children, and he spent a great deal of time sleeping. When I went to the church and I told them, they first told me that I would need to go to a counselor. Or I got the impression it was them that would tell me the counselor I needed to go to, and that they would form a committee. And they did specify that there would be both men and women on the committee. And that basically whatever that committee said, that they would take their word for it. So if that committee ended up saying this is a biblical divorce, they would accept it. But also if that committee said this is not a biblical divorce, they would not accept it. And I hung up with the pastor when he told me this about the committee. And I did weigh on it for a little while, but then I went back to him and I said, I'm just going to go through with the divorce. And I did that in part because I felt like if I go to this committee, I'm not guaranteed that they're going to see things my way. And if they don't see things my way and they end up ruling that it's not a biblical divorce, then I'm stuck in this situation where I either have to stay in this very, very destructive marriage, or I have to outwardly defy the church to their face, where they told me you do not have a biblical reason for marriage, for divorce, and you did it anyway. And so I felt like the lesser of two evils was just to not waste their time and just be like, look, thank you for the offer, but I'm convinced that I need a divorce and I'm going to move forward with the divorce. So I told them that. And I also told them, because there's this whole thing in scripture, I think you have a mainly Christian audience, but where you're not supposed to hire a lawyer, that you're supposed to kind of work things out together. So in trying to keep with that, I wanted to just get a mediator and mediate with my now ex-husband and come to an agreement. And, I wasn't trying to take him for a ride. I felt like we'd still be able to be good co-parents together. So I was like, all right, I just want him to go to a mediator. So I had the mediation scheduled, and then my now ex-husband called the pastor, and told him that he wanted the session to rule about the biblicalness of our divorce. And then he tried to go to me and be like, I think you should see what our session has to say about this divorce before we move forward with mediation. And I kind of saw that. First of all, I already felt like I knew what the session would say. I had been speaking with a lot of the pastors' wives and pastors up until this point. And the wives were basically telling me, well, you shouldn't withhold sex out of revenge. You need to just have sex with your husband anyway. Kind of like things like, if you keep doing it, eventually your emotions will catch up. And there really didn't seem to be any kind of an understanding that what I was experiencing was not normal. And it seemed like when it all boils down, the important thing was that my husband was being satisfied in the bedroom, and whatever my experience was irrelevant. So because I felt like that was kind of the spirit of what I was going to meet in the session, I kind of said, no, I want to proceed with mediation. And so he went to one mediation, and then after the mediation, he sent me a text saying he wasn't going to attend any more mediations. He wasn't going to sign anything, and he wasn't going to move out of the house. So I'm in this house with a very angry person. And that's where it's at. So the session had their meeting. And after the session meeting, I got a call from the senior pastor, and he told me that they had voted to bar me from the Lord's table for 6 months, and that I had to step down from the worship team for 6 months. And then after that, I could just resume my activities at the church as per usual. So it was basically this kind of a slap on the wrist kind of thing. And at the time he told me, I actually cried tears of joy because I was so convinced that they were going to bring church discipline against me, and that because I was planning to get divorced anyway, I wasn't going to be repentant and I was going to get excommunicated. So because they had said, okay, we're going to give you 6 months and then you can just go back and be like nothing ever happened, I felt thankful. I was like tears of joy, crying tears of joy that they, were not going to excommunicate me and that was going to be the end of it. It wasn't until later. So at that point, I'm like, I need to be humble. I need to accept my punishment. And then I'm going to get to be a full-blown member of the church again, and so I'm serving out my punishment. But as I'm serving out my punishment, all these things start to kind of nag at me, like, well, why was it a foregone conclusion that I had to be disciplined? And why didn't my ex-husband get disciplined? I mean, I had presented evidence that he had been watching pornography, that I had tried to get him to go to counseling multiple times over the course of 4 to 6 years, and he would refuse to go. And he was admitting to all of these things. He wasn't saying I was a liar. So, but he was not getting disciplined because he was saying he wanted to stay in marriage. And that was the only thing that really mattered, was that he was willing to stay in the marriage and I was not. So at the end of my censure, the senior pastor asked me if I wanted to go to lunch with him and his wife and kind of do like a postmortem. We could discuss what happened. So I went to lunch with him and I asked him specifically, I said, why did the session choose to rule against me? Why did they not just like abstain? Just tell my ex, like, we're not going to rule, and he said at that time that once the session is activated, I remember he used that word activated. It was such a weird word. Once the session is activated, that they had to rule. And I didn't know the rules. I hadn't, read the BCO at this point or anything. So I was just like, okay, I guess you had to. You were doing what you had to do. And so I kind of accepted that. I went back to the church, tried to feel comfortable, and just couldn't feel comfortable anymore. So at that point I left. And then after I left, I started, I wanted to move on, but I couldn't. I was just still swimming, like, about how this was a church that I loved and I really wanted to be a part of it, and how this could have happened. Because I really felt at every stage I had done the best I could do in the moment. And so after a couple of years, I finally got to the point where it was not so painful to me that I was just a puddle of tears. And I decided to reach out to the church and ask them some questions. So I reached out to a woman who is the director of women's soul care for their church. And I kind of just posed like, look, I've been reading the BCO. I can see where there's a lot of things that they did that is not in accordance with what the BCO says. Like, just to name a few, I wasn't notified in writing of what the charges were against me. There was no trial. I was given a set, determined amount of time that I was barred from the Lord's table. And that's not allowed. I was not notified in writing of the outcome of the trial or of, what my punishment was. And everything was just done over the phone, and so I started to throw all this out to the director of women's soul care, and she said, let me talk to the pastors. I'll get back to you. So she went and talked to a couple of the pastors, and she came back to me the very next day, and she told me that the church, that they said they didn't rule against you. There was no ruling. And they're like, there can't be a ruling unless there's a trial. And there was no trial. And I'm like, wait a second. But I was banned from the Lord's table. I was taken off the worship team. So how did that happen if there was no ruling? And she was like, oh, I don't know. I didn't ask them that question. And I'm like, and she said, it's just our common thing that when someone is not at peace with a brother, we ask them to abstain from the Lord's table. And I said, well, my husband wasn't asked to abstain from the Lord's table. If I wasn't at peace with him, wasn't he not at peace with me? And he definitely thought I was punished. I mean, he told my family even that the church had sided with him. So I presented all of this, and she says, I don't know. I didn't ask them all of those questions. All I can tell you is they said there was no ruling. So at this point, I'm feeling extremely gaslit. And I just tell them, I decide I'm going to send a letter this time to the entire session, plus the people who were on the session at the time of the ruling. Because in my mind, I'm thinking, if I can get enough people into this, I also wanted to include women. So women on staff and pastors' wives. If I can get enough people to see this, maybe I will actually find out what happened. Because on the one hand, I was very convinced that the session ruled against me. Now I'm being told there was no ruling. And I also request a copy of the minutes. When I get all of this information back, it turns out that during the session meeting, at a certain point in the meeting, they go into what's called executive session, and the minutes stop. And then executive session ends, and then the minutes resume again. And in the regular minutes, there is no mention of me whatsoever. So I basically come to the determination that whatever occurred in this executive session is the discussion of my divorce. And, so I start firing all these questions about the BCO, and the pastor comes back and he does acknowledge that he didn't follow the BCO, but he kind of says, I don't know what I could have done differently. I don't know what I would have done differently. And is quite accusing. Like, he's upset at me for involving the other people in it, involving the other session members and the women of the church in it. And he tells me that I'm not following Matthew 18. And he says that I could be charged with libel for what I was doing. So it did kind of feel a little like the gloves came off, I guess, because he's a very fatherly, very agreeable type man. And but yeah, so I guess that's kind of at the point where I am now, and where I've kind of like lost trust in the system, because at the end of the day, well, that was another thing. I did think at one point that I was being disciplined because I got an unbiblical divorce. I'm sorry. When the senior pastor responded to my last letter, he said that they couldn't have ruled on my divorce because I refused to do the whole committee thing. And so he said, all we could rule about was your refusal. So what I was really being disciplined for was not getting divorced. I was being disciplined for not following the procedure that they had set out. And so I did tell him, and I think what they realized is, wow, excommunicating her for that seems a little heavy-handed. And so they didn't want to take it to its full conclusion of excommunication. And so that they did this whole roundabout loophole, doing executive session, so there won't be any presbytery oversight, in order to subvert that. I mean, I can't say for sure, but I'm just saying, sitting from where I am now, that is what it looks like happened.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I do find it very ironic that I was disciplined for not following church procedure by a group who was not following church procedure.
That's true. Yeah, that is ironic. That's very ironic. I'm going back a little bit, and then I'll ask some concluding questions too. When you brought up what was happening in your marriage, the abuse, the neglect, the abandonments, the porn, did the session talk to your ex-husband at all about some of this stuff? Say, hey, is this like, what are you doing? Is this true? Can you talk to us about this? Because at least the way it's being presented, it seems like you brought it up and they looked at you versus the husband. It's like, I just want to stay in this marriage. And they're like, oh, that's good enough for us.
Yeah, my understanding is they did have some kind of an attempt at counseling him. I was not privy to whatever went on with that. But my understanding from talking to the director of women's soul care is that he was not cooperative with their attempts to counsel him, that he either didn't follow through on assignments they would give him, or kept rescheduling, didn't show up, that kind of thing. And so the one thing that kind of amused me was as she was relaying what the pastors said, she kind of said, well, you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. And it was just kind of accepted. And I just thought, wow, that's really different than how I was treated when I didn't do their thing. It's like, so he didn't have any charges brought against him. He didn't get any kind of discipline for not following through on what they were wanting him to do, because he didn't want to get divorced.
Is that, as far as you can tell, is that the only thing that of it, when he's like, I don't want to get divorced, but then again, he's like, but I'm not going to do anything about it. Well,
one of the things about him is he doesn't say like, no, I'm not going to do it. He'll tell you he'll do it. He just doesn't follow through.
I see. Gotcha. So you never had any discipline against him whatsoever?
No.
And you were the one whom was trying to put things back together, and at least maybe on the front end save the marriage. Like, hey, this is going on in my marriage. I don't know what's going on with this stuff. And then he's the one who's I listened to your bare marriage interview, and he's sleeping on the couch and doing nothing, and having a grand old time on his own. Which, thinking back on this now, before two concluding questions, what do you see now in this situation that maybe you didn't see then? Or you didn't know the BCO, you weren't in the. For those who are listening, it's the Book of Church Order. What do you see now that you didn't see then, and how they're treating you and how they're treating your husband? Because it may not have been clear to at this point. It's like, why is this happening to me? Why am I being blamed for this? Why am I being disciplined for this? And then you like you said, you'll kind of assume that their disciplinary measures are the right disciplinary measures, and not just not something that's just being placed on you. So what do you see now that you didn't see then? If you see something different now that you didn't see then.
Well, yeah, I definitely think that the fact that I was a woman had a lot to do with the way things panned out. I think there's a few layers to that. I do think there's an element of a fear of wokeism within the Presbyterian Church, the PCA. And I think there was kind of like, if we affirm her as being, a victim, that we're playing into this woke idea that, men are toxic masculinity. Men are toxic and women are abused, and like that they have to keep that a really hard black and white line, that if they affirm that women are being mistreated in their marriage, that's kind of it's becoming feminist in some way in their brain. And I don't think that they would articulate it quite that way. In fact, there was one point in my letter that I had said to the senior pastor that there was one point in my letter that I said that I thought I would have been treated differently, as that this was harder because I was a woman. I think was how I said it. It was harder because I was a woman. And I didn't accuse them of being misogynistic in any way. I just said it was harder because I was a woman. And he immediately fired back in his letter, like, I am not a misogynist. I don't, and he took it very personally. And I never thought he was a misogynist. I honestly don't think he is the problem. But I think there are good men in the PCA, even good, like, complementarian men who because they are good men can't imagine other men using that to treat their wives badly. And I think if you're a good complementarian man, you need to recognize that there are men that use complementarianism as a reason to subjugate their wives. And because you're projecting your goodness onto all men, and that's not the case. I was a heavily complementarian woman. I 100% would have agreed in submission, and I am not that anymore, because I personally saw how that was used and what that did. If my church wanted to get behind me, they could have very easily found a biblical grounds for me to get divorced. They knew my husband had a pornography issue, and Christ himself said that if you look at a woman to lust after her, you've already committed adultery in your heart. So they could have looked at that and said, that is adultery. She has grounds for biblical divorce. But they don't want to affirm that pornography is a form of adultery, because a lot of them have porn issues. A lot of men in the congregation have porn issues. And if that's the case, then they have a lot of women that have biblical grounds for divorce. And they don't want a lot of women to have biblical grounds. So,
Yeah, that's a good point. So second to last question, we have been accused of blanket statements against NAPART denominations and say, well, it's not all OPCs. It's not all, people wouldn't really say, people would say, yes, it's all CRECs, and so would we. But they'd say one story or a few stories. Yeah, those are the bad stories in these congregations. And same as the PCA. This is one PCA. This is just one church. This is just one woman's story. What would you say to somebody who, when they hear a story like yours or anybody else, say, but that's just one church? If you can talk to those who might say something like that.
I'd say that you just haven't ruffled their feathers yet. I think one of the very difficult things within the PCA, and I believe a lot of these denominations, is there's kind of a lack of recognition of our own fallibility in terms of our ability to interpret scripture. And I remember when I was deep into the conservative PCA, having this thought to myself about, like, well, I know I must be wrong about something, but I have no idea what that would be. and thinking that's because the Bible was so clear on these subjects. And I do feel like there's a little bit of an intellectual dishonesty there. Because if you go back in church history and you start reading some of the church fathers, you realize a lot of these biblical disagreements have been there since the very beginning, and that there are decent arguments and strong biblical arguments on both sides of the fence. There's a good biblical argument for egalitarianism. There's a good biblical argument for complementarianism. And so these are where you need to start just giving each other grace and recognizing, like, you know what, I could be wrong here. And if we don't have that healthy acknowledgement of our own fallibility and our own ability to be wrong, then I think we tend to try to put God in the box of our own making. We make the box that God is supposed to fit in. And then when he doesn't fit, instead of, we try to make him fit rather than looking at our own interpretation of scripture and how we might have gotten it wrong. But I'm sorry, I feel like I went on a tangent there.
No, that's good. That's really good. Yeah. Sorry, one last question before final thoughts. I should have asked this in the beginning, but now it's coming to me. When your husband first started reading Doug Wilson, did you know anything about Doug Wilson? Was it just like, oh, this is just another minister who has something to say? My husband's reading it, and yeah, he's turning a little bit. Did you look at Doug after that was happening? Like, what was that like?
No, not at the time. Like I said, my ex was always reading, and so I did. I knew a little bit about Doug. I knew that he was very kind of controversial. And I think the church, if you went to the church and talked about Doug, they would have considered him fringe. But at the same time, I remember seeing one of the pastor's wives recommending a book by Rachel Jankovic. And, like there were things like that, like, yeah, he's fringe, but this was a very kind of common thing I would hear among the men. And I don't want to attribute this to the church, but it's men in the church. Mm-hmm. Was like, yeah, sure, Doug's kind of rough around the edges. And then it was like, but he's got good theology. And it's like, if you are just kind of being a jerk, then that's a sign that something is fundamentally wrong with your theology. We shouldn't be able to look at someone who is not Christ-like, who is not exhibiting the fruits of the Spirit, and say they have good theology. That's just, it's completely antithetical to Christ or the gospel.
That's good. You answered the question I was going to ask as a follow-up on, those in the church, because that's what we see. We hear that all the time, and people will say, well, we have officially proclaimed Doug either heretical or out to the bounds of Reformed Orthodoxy, but he's got some good things to say on the family. He's got some good things to say on marriage. He's got good things to say on family rearing. And like, you realize what you're doing, right? It's like, all this other stuff is not great, but this stuff is really good. And so how else do you think he's going to get all of other, if you bring a little bit of him, everything else is going to come in with that as well, or at least it tends to be. So last question, that's not really a question, but it's more so anything that Joyce wants to end with. What do you want to leave those listening with? It's whether that be your experience, whether that be like parting thoughts to those who are listening on what happened to you or getting out, whatever it is. What does Joyce want those listening to come away with this conversation with?
Oh, wow. Well, I would say if you're a pastor or an elder, within a Presbyterian denomination, or I'd say even a Reformed denomination, you need to realize when a woman comes to you, that the first priority needs to be safety. One of the things that happened to me was once my husband said that he was not going to attend any more mediation. He wasn't going to leave the house, that kind of thing. I went to my pastors and I told them, I showed them the texts where my husband had said that he wouldn't leave, he wouldn't go to mediation, he wouldn't sign anything. So essentially he was claiming that he was going to keep me hostage to the marriage. And I showed this to the pastors and they said, well, we've already ruled against you. So you've tied our hands. And to me, that was one of the worst moments because I was so utterly desperate in that moment for their help. And they said, not only did they say their hands were tied, but I tied their hands. And and that was the fact that they believe that is a shame because the only thing tying their hands in that moment was their own indifference. They could have helped me if they wanted to. And I want to tell pastors, if you are complementarian, if you are in a complementarian church, then in a situation where it's a husband and a wife, a woman and a man, you need to assume that that woman is at a disadvantage. She needs an advocate because she is already being seen as someone who needs to be under. Because there were so many times that I did not come forward because I was afraid of saying something negative about my husband and then having it be a black mark on me that I said something bad about him, rather than it being acknowledged that what he was doing to me was wrong. And if you're a woman, what I guess I want to say to women who may be in my situation where I was, I felt like if I went against the church, that I was going against God. And I felt that if I went against the church, that I was jeopardizing my salvation. And what I found out was that that's just not true. What a session says about your standing before God has nothing to do with your actual standing before God. So if that's where you're at, and that's the only thing that's holding you to a marriage, then just know that, Jesus has compassion.
Now we move on to Lynna Sutherland and Donna Westcott, a daughter-mother combo. Lynna runs advocacy from the Presbyterian pew, and Donna speaks on the intersection of the church, counseling, and theology. We'll talk about the Book of Church Order, navigating the church court system, how abuse cases are handled in the PCA, both well and not well, thoughts on biblical counseling, how the church receives or doesn't receive the wisdom from secular counseling and therapy world, and more. I'll let them introduce themselves.
Sure. My name is Lynna Sutherland, and the organization that I'm connected with regards to the topic we're discussing here is Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew, or just Presbyterian Pew.
And then Donna?
I'm Donna Westcott. I'm a licensed professional counselor with a Christian counseling agency in Richmond, Virginia. I think and talk and write about some of these issues on my blog at donnawestcott.com. And there's a T in the middle of Westcott.
Perfect. Cool. And we'll link all this stuff in the show notes too for the episodes that you're on. So first question, and Lynna, I'll start with you, and then Donna after that. How did you first become acquainted with Doug Wilson, either hearing his name or reading his books, whatever it may have been, or his theological influence, and then in particular, his influence on the PCA?
Yeah, so I'll answer from my perspective as a daughter. And some of this came into my life when I was a teenager. So, I'm thankful that Mom can kind of give her perspective as being an adult and a parent at the time that we encountered some of this. But my best friend growing up and the maid of honor in my wedding, her father is a staunch Confederate apologist, connected with Vision Forum, Joe Morecraft, Reconstruction, various things like that. So I think that's probably the first exposure I had to a lot of those ideas. I don't know if I really knew the name Doug Wilson early on, although I do remember hearing early on about Credenda Agenda, the print magazine that that came out every so often. When I was in high school, our pastor's nephew, who attended another PCA church down further near the coast, invited me to attend the Christian Worldview Student Conference, which was hosted by that church. And that conference was, hosted speakers. Doug Wilson was definitely there. I went for 2 years in a row. He was there both years, I believe. Steve Wilkins, Steve Schlissel, George Grant, Howard Phillips, who was a Constitutional Party candidate for president and the father of Doug Phillips of Vision Forum fame. So that's kind of how I began to be familiar with some of these ideas. And, I think the thing that concerns me ongoing to this day is that, even though the PCA has come out with a pretty solid statement and other Reformed denominations have as well about the problems with federal vision theology, there are so many threads that are still present, especially when you're talking about issues of, gender roles and authority and submission and mom can speak more to it, but what a biblical counseling model looks like, various things like that, that is just a continual reminder to me that even if a church, as a denomination would generally say, oh, we don't, we're not fans of Doug Wilson or we don't recommend his materials. There's so much kind of adjacency and overlap between the PCA, and I'm speaking of the PCA just because that's the one I'm particularly familiar with, but not just the PCA, other Reformed denominations as well. There's so much overlap and there's so much adjacency between, church members flowing back and forth between different denominations and even, pastors and elders. And, the way I would describe it is that it's kind of in the groundwater. So unless you're in a church where this problematic teaching is being called out and identified as problematic, it's probably at some level infiltrating, the consciousness of the church membership, perhaps unaware.
Gotcha. Then Donna, how did you, as the mother, how did you come into contact in some way, shape, or form with Doug Wilson or his influence?
Well, as Lynna mentioned, there was a man in our church who was very much influenced by and promoting Doug Wilson. He brought a lot of his books into the church. I read some of those. And initially, I was attracted because he was very serious, about his faith and how that worked out into all parts of your life. I began looking eagerly every Sunday to see if there was a new issue of Credenda Agenda, because he had a really biting sense of humor, which I liked for a while. But as I began reading more, I realized I'm coming away with this really yucky feeling after reading the material. And that feeling was due to just the condescension and the judgmentalism that was coming through, that we have this all figured out and we are going to tell you how you should be doing things.
Gotcha. And then I'm curious too, and Lynna brought this up, how did you see the creep in your own practice of professional psychology, the biblical counseling movement? Where'd you see that too?
Well, early on, as I was feeling that yuckiness, and part of that would be in articles about, maybe his wife would write something to young wives about, how they needed to behave and don't be lazy and don't be whiny. And I began to define his method of biblical counseling as, got a problem? Aw, your fault. So it's very much that judgmental feeling. And I think those books disappeared from our church after a while. And I wasn't really too aware of his influence again until maybe seriously in the last 5 years or so, just because of the internet and of seeing more information from him, critique of him. I think probably I was more aware of nouthetic counseling, biblical counseling, more than I was his particular name.
Yeah, which, correct me if I'm wrong, nouthetic counseling isn't a terribly far cry from Doug Wilson's brand of biblical counseling either.
Not at all. And I think, that term nouthetic counseling has actually been changed to be called biblical counseling.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, and we'll dig into this more as well. So, Linda, you're associated with the advocacy group Presbyterian Pew. So, what is it? What does it do? And why do you do it?
Great question. It kind of came about slowly and organically. I've been in a PCA church in one way or another, either as a child or as a adult member for over 40 years now. And as with anything like that, you begin to realize that there are things that are familiar to you just because of years of experience that aren't necessarily familiar to others. And, I have a little bit of a nerdy streak, wanting to look into things and understand them better. And, so I was curious about General Assembly and what happens there, and the Book of Church Order and what's that all about. And those interests kind of intersected with having had some personal connections with watching church leadership handle cases of abuse, and seeing that sometimes go well and sometimes not at all well, and just realizing the position that people are in, as lay people in a PCA church. I think in general, in its very most basic form, I think a Presbyterian style of church government is based on biblical principles. I think it's biblical to have a group of elders leading a church as opposed to one CEO type guy. I think it's biblical for local church leaders to confer together, to settle doctrinal disputes and things like that. So I definitely see scriptural roots, but, researching recently kind of the beginnings of what we think of as Presbyterianism back in the 1500s in Scotland, we've come a long way since then. And, not all bad, but what we have now is an extremely complex, multi-layered document that is, first of all, on the face of it, can be challenging to understand just reading over it and following what you're looking at. But beyond that, there's so much more to, like if I have a question about the Book of Church Order and I text 3 or 4 guys I know who are really strong in this, I might get 3 or 4 variations of, how to think about this chapter, or, there was this case that applied or whatever. And so it's one thing to, you can download the PDF, you can read it, but there's kind of a culture that develops around a document like that. So about 3 years ago, I started running a Facebook group during the General Assembly to help people follow what's happening in a General Assembly. That's kind of the most public. I mean, it's live streamed, so you can watch it from anywhere. It's kind of the most public way to sort of watch what's happening in the PCA, but that is really hard to follow. I mean, even as a person who's been seriously putting an effort into this for 3 or 4 years, I'm still having to ask a lot of questions to understand particular things, why they're unfolding the way they do. And so after running that Facebook group for several years, one of the challenges is, a Facebook group is not a great way to organize information sequentially. And so, we needed just a better platform so that people could work through some of this information in a sequential way to have the background that they needed to understand what was going on. We started developing online courses. And then, the other half of the picture the first half is what I kind of call polity on paper. Like, hey, look, here's what this paragraph says, and this is what it means, and here's another paragraph that's related to it. But the other half of the picture is like, well, what does it actually look like when a case follows through based on this paragraph, or when this part of the procedure is followed, or what amendments have been made to this section recently, and why? What was kind of the story? Because oftentimes when there are overtures, like amendments proposed to change sections of the Book of Church Order, there's often a story behind it. There's some case where they found out, okay, well, there's a loophole here we need to fix, or we see a string of things happening in a certain direction that are a problem and we need to address that. And so it's not just a matter of, here's what it says in black and white on this piece of paper, but it's also understanding kind of the news and the developments and the stories. So, polity on paper versus polity in practice, and helping people to understand both of those aspects of being members in a Presbyterian church.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm formally trained in this. I have a master's in divinity from a reputable seminary, Westminster, California, and the BCO of both the OPC, Orthodox Presbyterian Church, and the Presbyterian Church of America. Those are still way above my head, even though I'm formally trained in this. And I know people who have devoted their entire life to Robert's Rules of Orders, which is, basically the underlying document for anything church order. It is the most complex system I have ever heard of, besides like government bureaucracy. Is it, this is just a random question. Is it intentionally that way, or is it just kind of built that way over time?
Yeah, I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt and say that it's not intentionally built that way. Okay. Just from what I've watched unfold, I think just like our, state or federal government, just like policies for, a school or whatever, over time, there are issues that come up and you realize, oh, there's nothing here that addresses that, or, there's a loophole here that we didn't realize until these kind of situations started happening or whatever. And, there has been an effort over time to, there are paragraphs where, okay, let's consolidate this and put two things together that are grouped better here and different things like that. So I don't think it's intentionally meant to be, exclusionary to those who aren't familiar with it. But it is a pretty big learning curve.
Yep. So I think too, something that's underlying this conversation and these episodes in this series overall, and I'll get into trauma-informed and trauma-informed churches and counseling and everything else later, but building the foundation first. One of the things I've heard of, and I'm sure both of you have heard of multiple times, is even the counseling aspect, when we go into abuse more particularly, is something that churches have a hard time with. And they fall on either side of the tracks, per se. We're just going to use the Bible, or we're quote unquote just going to use secular psychology. And then when you try to form them in some way, shape, or form into one, there's so many disagreements on what this looks like. And so, Donna, on your work on the integration of psychology and theology, with a particular focus on psychology and biblical counsel, can you talk about your training, what you've seen in churches, and how they understand counseling in general?
Okay. Well, I have a master's degree in counselor education, as well as additional graduate level courses. I did, my practical counseling training and had to pass an exam to be licensed in the state of Virginia. And we also have to maintain continuing education credits every year.
Yep.
So that you're really staying up with new developments. And besides that, I just love to read about counseling and psychology and theology. So that's my background. So one of the important parts of that training is that there's a board of counseling in every state. And if I were to commit malpractice, another counselor, my client, whoever could report me. So there's accountability.
Mhm.
You know, they would look into what my practice had been and make a judgment about whether that was good practice or not, and whether I was really qualified to remain as a counselor. So that's one of the big differences between licensed counseling and biblical counseling. Is just for biblical counseling, you know, there are now seminary courses in biblical counseling, so they're getting a lot of coursework. It's not, you know, really related to anything in the psychology world. It's more, what does the Bible say about this? How do we handle these problems that come up using the Bible? There's no test. There's no accreditation. You can get a certificate, but it's, you know, it just means, well, you've taken these courses. So there's no oversight. There's no supervision when you're getting started. There's no board to judge whether you have practiced faithfully or whether you've made a mess of things.
Mhm.
So, you know, to me, that's a big difference. Biblical counseling used to be called nouthetic counseling, and I think they changed the name just because every time you said nouthetic, you had to explain what it meant.
Mhm.
But the basic idea is the Bible is sufficient for any kind of counseling situation. It's sufficient to be a guide to our lives. And I think there's a number of ways in which biblical counseling has a very constricted and distorted lens through which they're looking at the world. So the first one is just really in their theology and how that informs their anthropology, that they almost look at the Bible like a how-to manual. If you have this problem, then here's the verse that you apply to it. You do this. That should clear things up. So that's a constricted view of just how the Word of God operates in our lives. I think they're also constricted because they, of course, you know, Scripture is our authoritative, definitive Word of God.
Mhm.
And that's where we need to start when we start talking about who are humans, how do they operate, what's best for them. But at creation, God told us to have dominion over the world, to subdue it. And I think that, you know, we've called that the creation mandate. That's the command. Go out, explore this creation, learn everything you can about it, make use of it, make practical application of it. And to me, that covers, you know, art, science, language, creativity, and surely human beings are part of that.
Mhm.
God also created a very logically consistent cosmos. So that's our basis for science. We can make observations. We can do tests. And we should be able to replicate our findings. So, of course, we can't test on humans the way we could on bacteria,
Mhm.
but we can observe and we can come up with consistent observations. So that's my first kind of my starting point, is that humans are part of God's creation. And it's very legitimate for us to study them and to find out things that may not be explicitly spelled out in Scripture, but they're still in the revelation that God gives in nature. There's an awful lot, even in the first 3 chapters of Genesis, about humankind.
Mm-hmm.
Most importantly, being made in the image of God. What does that mean? What does it mean if I'm in the image of God? Well, does it matter if I'm a Christian, or do non-Christians retain the image of God? I think they do.
Mm-hmm.
How does that affect how we look at people? It helps me to come to people with a much more welcoming, positive, supportive point of view in my counseling. There's so much more, so many riches there. But with nouthetic, with biblical counselors, this lens is very narrowly focused on sin. It's like they don't read the first 2 chapters of Genesis. They jump to chapter 3, and the beginning point of their whole anthropology is the fall. And I did the same thing. It was a learning curve for me to come to this understanding. But when they do that, then, when you have a hammer in your hand, everything looks like a nail. So what they're doing in their counseling sessions is looking for sin that the client needs to repent of. It's a very truncated view of human beings, of what their motivations are, of what the effects of living in a fallen world are. Even they'll say, well, we know not everything is sin. You might really be sinned against. But look at your reaction. Is your reaction sinful? So there's always that very negative scrutiny. What do you need to repent from?
Mm-hmm. That's a really helpful background. Yeah. And I think that's going to help inform both what Lynn and I will talk about, but also abuse in general, because a lot of abuse victims will be told, well, how are you responding to your abuse? Maybe you should repent of the unforgiveness that you have in your heart for your abuser.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that, our emotions are not there as a result of the fall. Our emotions are part of how we were fearfully and wonderfully made. They serve good and constructive purposes in our lives.
Yep.
So we can't just ball it all up and call it sin and have a one-size-fits-all answer to that, which is repent.
Yep. Yeah. And especially so for women. I think women are the ones who are directed at for their emotions and say, well, especially the Wilson daughters will say, or Nancy, Doug's wife, will say your emotions are bad. They're a result of your unchecked feminine desires for control, or your unchecked feminine understanding of a logical male mind, and you can't have these emotional desires because those are sinful desires. When, like you said, I think they don't read Genesis 1 and 2 as the good creation that was then marred by sin. Not human beings are not sinful in the heavenly eschaton, like the heavenly new creation, which means sin is not core to who we are. It is the marring of who we are. So yeah, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that, Donna.
Oh, I have tons. Yeah. So, I actually asked a former pastor, do you know what the first thing was that God said to the woman? And I could tell that he knew it was a trick question. He said, what? I said, the first thing that God said to a woman was, have dominion, rule, subdue.
It was given to both. Yep.
Yep.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, this is going to be good foundation, especially, I think, for Lynn and I to talk about the BCO and how abuse is either handled or mishandled, how elders understand abuse. And then Donna will talk about trauma informed and how this has to play into psychology and into therapy and into how elders understand all this stuff. So all this is wrapped up. So Lynna, you talked about the BCO being there, and it's not necessarily obtuse and intentionally difficult to understand, but it's been built up over time. But like you said, it's there. And even Donna, it was helpful to you say for the psychological practice that there are accountability aspects to this, because you have a board of directors over the state, and they make sure that you have continuing education, that your clients can go to them if you have any problem with your psychological practice, which is interesting. And I'll get into this later, that a lot of Reformed Christians have a hard time with psychology, even though we believe in the same stuff on accountability in our Presbyterian structures. So with the BCO, provides accountability, checks and balances for ministers and presbyteries. So it's ostensibly there for this purpose. I mean, not for this purpose particularly, but it's helpful for those who do have issues in PCA churches. It gives members, or should give members, confidence that what they bring up to presbytery, what they bring up to the elders, what they bring up to the session is going to be taken seriously. So why, and I'm going to slightly change my word, why can it be so difficult for many who've been abused or many who've been wronged to get a fair hearing if this is part of what the BCO is there for?
Yeah, so I'm going to start out by saying, I have seen the process used well and used to do exactly what it's meant to do, which I know you're not implying that it isn't. But I think that's important to note because, when we see it used well, that illustrates that it isn't really the policy that creates good or bad situations. It's the people using the polity that create,
that's a good point,
healthy or unhealthy outcomes for people in churches. So I think in any church, in any, denomination or flavor of Christianity that you're discussing, there are going to be things about that type of church government that are going to be, vulnerabilities or weak points. And so I think the job of any church, whether you're, in a congregational church like the, Southern Baptist Church, or whether you're in a church that has a hierarchy like, the Methodist Church or the Catholic Church, it is the prerogative and the responsibility of those, especially those in leadership, to be aware of where the loopholes, the blind spots, those cracks that abusers can fall into, or those things that they can twist to their advantage, and be aware of those. And I think, again, I'm speaking about the PCA because that's where I'm most familiar. I'm sure this could be said about just about any denomination, but there's a fear that if we say, here are the potential vulnerabilities in our system, that we're somehow denying what we believe about scriptural principles for church government. So in other words, if we say, here are some potential vulnerabilities in a Presbyterian system of government, we worry that we're saying actually Presbyterianism isn't right, we should be Baptist instead or something.
If there's vulnerabilities, it means the system itself might be flawed in some way, which is not what you're saying necessarily.
Well, I mean, we should all be willing to admit that the system could be flawed, but it doesn't necessarily have to mean that. So, I'm a homeschool mom. I've homeschooled my 8 children. The oldest 2 have graduated. The other 6 have always been homeschooled. I put a lot of my time and energy into that. Mm-hmm. But I don't need to feel threatened when people point out, here are ways that homeschooling is used to abuse or to cover up abuse. That doesn't have to rattle me. I can say, okay, then as a homeschool mom, I should be on the front lines of pointing out how this system can be misused and abused, how it can harm children, and what we need to do to protect the most vulnerable. And I don't need to feel that my choice to homeschool is threatened by those acknowledgments and by that work. So the same thing is true in the PCA. First of all, we have to be willing to say we are a man-made system. And just like any other man-made system, there are going to be, loopholes in the system, or just that, even the best system can cause harm if it's not used well. As you said, what Mom spoke about a moment ago just transitions beautifully into this, because a lot of the problems that we see really are based on faulty theology. So, for example, of resistance to just learning more about abuse dynamics, because anything that sounds like secular psychology or anything that wasn't written by somebody who speaks Reformedese, is immediately suspicious. There's, sometimes there's like a culture warrior mentality. So anything that sounds like feminism, or it sounds like the Me Too movement, or anything like that, we can't allow ourselves to be influenced by any of that, because, then we're capitulating to culture. We have a bit of our identity tied up in our decisions about women in leadership. So when churches came out of the PCUSA to form the PCA, there was, one of the concerns that churches cited about the PCUSA, and one of the reasons why they felt they needed to come out and form a new denomination was because of the ordination of women. And so, women are not ordained in any PCA churches. And yet there can be this, dare I say it, triggering response when there's a suggestion that women should be involved in a process, or that women's advice should be sought, or that women's perspective is important. We're not saying, you have to ordain women, but anything like that, there can be this, this kind of emotional response on the part of men in leadership who feel that, this somehow threatens our identity, as not that. We're not the PCUSA. We don't do that. And again, I'm speaking broadly, and I'm speaking specifically in places where we see problems happen. I think, misinterpretation of scriptural passages about divorce. So, the only time you can ever divorce is if your husband goes out and has a physical affair with another woman. Then, if she comes and she says, all these terrible things are happening in my home, well, I'm really sorry, but there aren't really any other options. So we'll pray for you, and you can take comfort in knowing that you're participating in the sufferings of Christ, but we're not really sure what else we can do about that. So, a lot of it, it's not even about the process and the procedure. It's really just about cultural, theological assumptions that can create a real roadblock. Like no church in the PCA is going to say, oh, we actually are fine with abuse happening in our church, or we actually we don't deal with abuse in our church. What would happen instead was that they would look at a situation and say, well, that's not abuse. This situation isn't a situation of abuse. And as I mentioned before, the PCA process, I would guess that most people who are members in PCA churches are aware that there is a process. There's this thing. We have presbyteries, we have General Assembly. They might not understand how that works, but they have a general awareness. Like there's this process, right? And if I had a problem, I could use this process. But what I've seen time and again when folks have come to me with questions is that you have to have some level of awareness of how the process works in order to recognize when it has been misapplied, or when the process has been eclipsed. So, if the church just says, well, you did this thing, so this is our decision, this is what we're going to do. If you're not familiar with the Book of Church Order, how are you going to say, actually, that's not according to the Book of Church Order? You've eliminated some rights that I had, or you've, eclipsed the process by not doing these steps. How would you know that? How would you have the awareness to say, oh, here's a time when I need to go to presbytery because they haven't followed the book of church order, unless you have some, base level of understanding. And it's not just a matter of, do you have a PDF of the BCO, but there's so much history and culture layered on it. So you might come to your session with the book of church order in your hand and say, this chapter says that this is supposed to happen. And what if they respond with, well, historically, that's not how that paragraph has been interpreted. And this case that came before the Standing Judicial Commission set a precedent. So this is how it's generally interpreted. What are you going to say to that?
Yeah.
You don't have the background and the experience to say, no, that's only true in cases of XYZ. That doesn't apply in this situation. All you can do is go, oh, okay, I guess so. I don't really know what to do with that. Another challenge is that our book of church order and especially the system of courts and the system of making appeals through those courts is designed to give deference to lower courts. It is designed to, give the benefit of the doubt to the decisions of the lower courts. And there's some, practical reasoning for this. You would assume, in a best case scenario, that the local elders at a local church would be the ones who, they know the people involved. They know the situation better, right? So the guys at Presbytery and then further on up, the guys on the Standing Judicial Commission, they don't know these people personally. So it makes sense, that there would be, that they would defer to the local elders. But I'm just going to read you this passage from the Book of Church Order. It says, a higher court should ordinarily exhibit great deference to a lower court regarding those factual matters which the lower court is more competent to determine because of its proximity to the events in question and because of its personal knowledge and observation of the parties and witnesses involved. Therefore, a higher court should not reverse a factual finding of a lower court unless there is clear error on the part of the lower court. So this isn't just, an inherent bias. This is actually part of our polity that deference is going to be given to the decisions of the lower court. So if an abuse victim feels like they have not been treated well or their case was not handled properly, they have perhaps some chance, if they can prove that there's some part of the Book of Church Order that wasn't followed, like, hey, they handed out a punishment without letting me have a trial. Mm-hmm. Okay, the presbytery might say, yep, you're right. Here's the paperwork. We can see that they didn't do that. They should, they have to have a trial. They can't give you a punishment without a trial, a censure. But if it's a matter of like, these guys didn't really listen. They weren't caring. They weren't, they didn't, make me feel heard and understood and protected. I mean, that's not the kind of thing that's going to be able to be adjudicated through an appeal. And even were a woman to carry her case all the way up on a specific matter, like, for example, she leaves her abusive husband and her local congregation excommunicates her because they feel like she's, disobeyed God by leaving her husband. So she appeals to the presbytery. They agree with the lower, with the session. She appeals to the to the highest court, the Standing Judicial Commission, and they find in her favor. Okay, well now what's going to happen is that her church session is going to go into their records and change the records so that, okay, you're no longer excommunicated. But that church is still never going to be a place where she feels believed, where she feels safe to worship, where she feels like, the session is going to have her best interest in mind and respect her perspective on things. So, even if she were to go through all the process and quote unquote win her case in the end, she's not going to ever attend that church anymore. And she may not ever want to be in the PCA if she's been mistreated by her session and her presbytery. There's no local church she could go to that wouldn't be in that presbytery. So, there's a limit to what the process can actually do. And I think that's one of the things I've heard this again and again and again from abuse victims. They'll say, I joined a PCA church because I knew that there was this process, or, I grew up in the Southern Baptist church, and if something happened, there was really nothing we could do about it. So I joined a PCA church because I wanted that process in place. And, again, it can be used well, but there's not going to be any sort of situation where, like in the scenario I gave a moment ago, where the woman is, excommunicated for leaving her abuser. It's not going to come down from on high. Hey, you know what? You guys need some continuing education on abuse dynamics. You guys need to evaluate your leadership and consider whether the people who are on your session are really qualified to be elders. That's not going to happen. There's going to be, a legal decision. They're going to have to change their records. There's no way. I mean, and this is true of any church polity. You can't change hearts with judicial decisions. So, even just an understanding of the limitations inherent in the system, I think is important to understand why it, if abuse is handled well from the get-go by the local church, that's great. If it isn't, there's really not a lot that the process can do to change how that church will handle abuse cases going forward.
Yep. Two things I want to highlight, what you just said. And I had never quite thought about this until you would put it in a certain way. The first being cases handled well in the PCA, using the BCO correctly, whatever it may be, puts even more pressure to get abuse cases handled well, because these can be handled well. The fact that it can be handled well, like you said, I'd never heard it put this way, but it's really helpful, means it's not necessarily the system that is adjudicating these incorrectly. It's the people who are utilizing the system to adjudicate these incorrectly. And it actually puts more pressure on the people when there are cases that are done well and then abuse comes in. Maybe some are handled well, some are handled incorrectly, but the very fact that they can be handled well puts even more pressure on those who are adjudicating these cases to make sure we can do this. People have seen this done before. That means this should be done again in these cases. So it puts pressure on cases of abuse to handle these correctly. And then secondly, which would said, and I've heard this, and people hear stories on the series to this effect, where the woman does go to a higher court, or the case is brought to a higher court, and then her local session then starts pressuring her. It's like, well, you're not submitting to our authority. You're not submitting to your local elders. And if she does win the case, it's actually worse for her coming back to the church, because now her local session is questioning her submission. It's, well, you won this case, but you're not submitting to our authority. We are forced to submit to the higher authority, but you went past our authority. And I've heard stories like this, and people will hear stories like this. Even when their case is won, they still lose because the church is now questioning their submission.
That's right. Yeah. And I think, one additional important factor is that the Book of Church Order is really not designed to handle cases of abuse or even private sin. It's not, and I'm not saying that it was intentionally designed not to handle those things, but it really is best designed to handle things like heresy, right? So
doctrinal disputes, that's almost always what it should be used for. Yep.
Exactly. So if a pastor is preaching something that's heretical, you're going to have documentation. You're going to have,
that's why the BCO exists.
Exactly. Here's a sermon he preached. Here's an article he wrote. Here's a podcast he was on. These are examples of how, we can prove that he's teaching something. And then, the judicial process can be used to determine, is this actually, contradicting the Westminster Standards, or, you're dealing with evidence, right? But oftentimes in cases of abuse, there's no paperwork. I should say there's evidence. It just depends on whether people are able to see the evidence as evidence. So, if you have to have 2 to 3 witnesses, how often does somebody commit sexual harassment when 2 or 3 other people are watching?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yep.
And there's also not a lot of, again, another distinction in the BCO is the difference between personal sins and general sins. So like if a pastor is preaching heresy, he's not sinning against one person in particular. He's harming the whole church. So this is a general sin. This is something that the session or if it's a pastor, it would be the presbytery, should take up kind of on behalf of the church. Hey, for the health of the church, it's our job to step up and lead the charge in handling this problem. If it's a personal sin, the session or the presbytery can choose to address that as a general sin. So for example, if, a pastor was like sexually abusing little girls, yes, that's a personal sin that he's committed against, say those 3 specific little girls, but it's a general problem. It's a problem for the whole church because, of his role and the safety of others. So the presbytery ought to step up and handle that like a general sin problem. But oftentimes what happens in cases of abuse is the session kind of treats it like, well, I don't know, it's just he said, she said, so we're not gonna take this up. You're going to have to do it. If you think something's wrong, you're going to have to bring charges. You're going to have to kind of lead the process on this. And what's incredibly challenging about that is, so if a woman is coming forward and saying, hey, my husband's treating me this way, and the session is skeptical and seems, resistant to helping her, well, if she brings charges, those guys are the court that she has to, present her case before. So they've already unofficially, neglected and disbelieved her. Why would it be more likely that they would believe her in some kind of formal process? And then if the guys who know her best haven't believed her and cared for her, why would it make sense for her to think, well, these guys didn't do it well, but a whole bunch of strangers who are good friends with these guys will do it better?
Yeah. Yeah. And ordained these people too, and put them up and haven't yet deposed them, haven't questioned them, probably won't question them. Who do we think is going to win in this scenario? It's not going to be the woman.
And again, I have seen cases where the presbytery does hold a pastor to account, and that's a good thing. But I'm just speaking
Absolutely.
From the perspective of a woman. Is it really so irrational for her to say, yeah, I'm not going to try my hand at this. I'm not going to throw my hat into that ring because I saw how that went the first time. I'd rather not do that again.
Yep. Even me as a man, I think the same thing. And I can't imagine, what a woman who's not trained theologically, has no idea how the court system works. I barely know how the court system works, and I'm trained in this stuff. Yeah. Donna, it looked like you were going to say something. I want to hear what you're going to say, and I'll ask you the next question.
No, I think it was just a passing. I think I was going to comment about the irony of a session not submitting to their presbytery and then
ironies abound. Trust me, ironies abound. It is people here. I've got some thoughts, especially when it comes to the Trinity and patriarchy, which I think feeds into some of this stuff. We'll be going into the ironies pretty deeply. And so Donna, this one's for you, and we've already touched on this, building a foundation for this. Why, and I'll speak more particularly of the Reformed Church, although I know this is still a problem in the general church as well. Why is the church so fearful or neglecting of research-based, quote unquote, secular psychology, and so dogmatic on quote unquote biblical counseling, which doesn't mean much other than you're sitting and stop it? When we don't have a big problem with doctors, maybe we have a problem with lawyers, but when we need to get something done, it's legal, then we hire lawyers. We don't have a big problem in general with immune systems or cancer or anything else like that. But when it comes to psychology, we got a problem. So why are we so hesitant and fearful of this?
I think one underlying principle there is that we've developed this, and part of it's the culture war. We've developed this mindset of being embattled. And it's either biblical and it came from the Bible, or it's worldly. And worldly means anti-Christian. So we have this huge divide that we don't have in other areas, as you said. If your child has a heart problem, you go and look for the best pediatric cardiologist, and you don't ask him whether he's a Christian.
Yeah. You don't care. As long as you're like, heal my stinking child. I don't care if you're Christian or non-Christian.
Yeah. So, but we don't see counseling that way, because I think it involves emotions, and the Bible does address emotions, and we assume that that's the last word. My personal opinion is that if there's anything legitimate in counseling, you can find it in nugget form in the scripture. But there's still good reason for, observing the book of nature.
Mm-hmm.
God told us to learn from it. We're remiss if we don't.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that is the foundational principle. But then the two specific complaints that I hear from Christians who do not believe in secular psychology or counseling. Number one is modern psychology was invented by Freud. Freud was anti-Christian. So, the roots rotten, the fruit's rotten. And the other one is people go to counseling because they want to be able to continue to sin, but not feel bad about it.
Yeah.
So those are the big things that I hear. And really have had those said to me by very intelligent elders. And I just reply, I see a lot of Christians in my practice. And when Christians come to me with emotional distress, they are usually saying to me, I've tried to pray. Maybe I don't pray enough. God must be upset with me. I must be sinning in some way. I don't know. Can you help me figure this out? They're not trying to escape sin or to
They can't escape it. Yeah, that's the thing. They're so enmeshed with this. It's like, I got a problem. Not like I got to get away from my problem.
Right. And they have a strong desire to avoid sinning.
Yeah.
And to please God. So that's just a complete straw man. And I think with Freud, we just go back to the creation mandate. Yeah, he had some really screwy ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of parenthetically, his whole he observed, talked to children.
Mm-hmm.
He heard about incest.
Mm-hmm.
He began to talk about that, and he received so much pressure. He said, oh, no, it can't be true that incest is so prevalent. And so he turned to his theories of, how sexuality develops in children. So anyway, but yeah, I just think even, he was kind of in the beginning. You don't expect him to get it all right.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't keep us from being able to make accurate observations.
Yeah.
Another thing is that there are plenty of people who will critique, Christians who will critique secular counseling or psychology. And when I've heard them do this, for instance, in a seminary class, they're kind of cherry picking. They'll take a paragraph from a counseling book or, a quote or talk about a concept. And they're not being intellectually honest. They're not really giving a full explanation of what that concept means or how that's applied. They're really creating straw men. And so these pieces, these quotes that they cherry pick, they sound an awful lot like, yeah, people should always just do what they feel like doing, which is really not what's being taught or practiced.
So, Lina, taking this again, trying to build a foundation and talk about trauma-informed pastoral practice and elder meetings when they are confronted with an abuse case. I think all this stuff is wrapped up in one. And you've already said this about the BCO being used well for these cases, but also, in a sense, it's not meant for its purpose is not to adjudicate abuse cases. Well, like its purpose is to adjudicate heresy trials for doctrinal disputes, not necessarily for abuse cases, but you have seen abuse cases adjudicated well under the BCO, and you've seen abuse cases not adjudicated well through the BCO. So with this undergirding, if you can help those who are listening understand how to deal with abuse cases. So not just, okay, these are the principles you take from the BCO. This is how you approach a session. This is what they should be doing. But in general, how does a church work with a counselor, an abuse advocate, or civil government, or whatever it may be? How should a church use all that's at their disposal when they're dealing with an abuse case?
That is a huge question. We could go into another complete podcast. So I've got a summary version for you, just some things to think about. So first of all, I think the way to handle abuse well could be summed up in one word, and that one word is humility. It takes an awful lot of humility to approach something this, volatile, fraught with potential for causing further harm. And it really requires church leaders to leave their ego, their preconceived notions, and their assumptions at the door. That's not something that you can get from a book or from a, program or something. And many of the things that we've talked about already, just in terms of, the beliefs about psychology and the beliefs about divorce and the sufficiency of scripture, all of these things are kind of the underlying issues that need to be considered. Like, these are the questions that you need to ask yourself. So yes, it's great to have a policy in place, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But again, if you are going to have a policy for, like, here's how we handle abuse, well, you have to be able to recognize when it's time to trigger that policy and put it into place. If you can't recognize it, the policy is useless. It's just going to gather dust on a shelf because you'll never think that the case in front of you is abuse.
True.
So, a big piece of this is understanding what it looks like when someone comes forward to share about their abuse. Almost never is, I'm just going to use the example of, say, a woman who's experiencing domestic abuse. Almost never will she come and say, excuse me, my husband has been abusing me, and I have recorded in my diary a chronological list of all of the times that this has happened. Let me show you. And that's not how it happens. Usually what happens is a woman has an awareness that something's not right, but she's probably not even thinking in categories of abuse. She's been in a church where she's told that she's a sinner and that her heart is deceitfully wicked and that she shouldn't trust her own emotions and that, wanting her own way is selfish and prideful. And she's been living with a man who has been confirming that she's the problem, that she's failing as a wife, that the difficulties and the pain she's experiencing are her fault. She's been deeply indoctrinated. So she's going to come forward, usually in ways that might sound like normal marriage problems, right? So perhaps she says, to a friend, "Oh, I've been having a really hard time affording groceries recently." Right? Well, we all could say, "Oh man, yeah, this economy is so tough." Right?
Inflation's
So-
horrible. Everything's bad. Yeah,
Exactly,
of
right?
course.
So immediately we're thinking, "Oh yeah, this is just like my situation. I could teach her some coupon cutting strategies or something like that." But what if he gives her $100 a week to
Yep.
feed a family of 5?
Yep. That's not
Right.
even in our perception.
Right. Or, another really common one is one woman asks another, "Do you ever have trouble being in the mood for intimacy?" So again, that sounds like, oh, right, very typical marriage struggle. We could have, conversations about tips and strategies and all that kind of thing.
Get in the mood
But what
and
if-
wearing the right
Yeah.
stuff and
Exactly. Candles and music and whatever, but what if the problem is that he treats her as though she's disgusting 24/7? That doesn't make a person want to be
yeah.
intimate. So
Or he
there's a
forces
whole lot
himself
more.
on her, or he has expectations of her, whatever it is.
100%. So, so there's just a baseline of awareness and education that has to be present before any policy or procedure will be of any use. You have to know how to ask good questions. And a lot of times that has to be done by other women. First of all, because women are often not going to come to they're not going to say to their elder after church, "Hey, what do I do when I'm having trouble feeling in the mood?"
Yeah.
They're going to be talking to other women about this.
He'll get real comfortable. It's like, I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah, right. Well, let me get you in touch with my wife.
Exactly.
So, there need to be women who are trained to do this, and women who the church leadership empowers and asks for their feedback and even their pushback. That doesn't mean they have to be ordained. It just means that
Calm down before people. We're not saying they have to be ordained.
it means that we have a healthy theology of the church as the body of Christ.
Yeah.
And that we all have gifts that God has given. And it is not right for any of those gifts which God has gifted the church to be squelched, because that is a misuse of what God has gifted his church. So that's really the first step, is an awareness. Now, I know that might sound, wow, that's so vague and nebulous, and how, you've given a couple examples, but what is that really like? So I would recommend training, and there's a whole variety of ways to do that. I know some sessions will have like a speaker from the local domestic violence shelter come and speak to the elders and just say, "Hey, this is what you can be on the lookout for. This is, here are the resources we provide. If you're having concerns, reach out to us. This is what we can do," just at a local level, to be aware of what's available. And also there's a ministry called Called to Peace Ministries, and they are designed to they offer all kinds of services, but one of the things that they do is partner with churches, and they provide training, and they provide that kind of support. So if a pastor's like, "This situation's a little off, but I'm not sure what to do, or I don't know if it's abuse or whatever," that's exactly what they're there for. Another great ministry, and this one is super, I don't know, PCA Reformed focus. It's run by Dr. Anne-Marie Goodsword, and it's called Help Her. It's like the word helper, but with an extra H in there, Help Her. And they are specifically equipped to help in the PCA or OPC, Reformed kind of church process. So there are plenty of resources that are available that churches can, reach out to for training, for help as they're going through these processes. Also, in 2022, the PCA published the report of the Domestic Abuse and Sexual Assault Temporary Committee. So they commissioned a group of experts to write about essentially taking the wealth of information that's available out there and demonstrating how clearly this aligns with Scripture and also with our Westminster standards. Especially, if you go to your concordance and you look up abuse, you might not come up with anything, but if you look up oppression, there's plenty. So helping us to have an understanding of, God's heart for the oppressed, God's heart for the widow and the orphan, or those who are virtually widows and orphans, because those who should be their husbands or their fathers have essentially abandoned them. One great thing about it's called the DASA report, DASA, domestic abuse and sexual assault. One great thing about this report is that it's broken down by type of abuse. So I would highly recommend that any church leaders just generally familiarize themselves with it. But also, if you have a particular situation come up, it's designed so that you can flip to the table of contents and go, okay, this is child sexual abuse. What do we do? Let's flip to that section. Certainly, crime should be reported to law enforcement immediately without hesitation. It is super, super important that churches not attempt to do their own kind of investigation. It's
nothing in-house. Nothing.
Yeah, exactly. It's in a sense, it's normal. Like, if one of my kids comes to me and says, my sister did this, well, what's the first thing I'm going to do? I'm going to go to the sister and be like, oh, did you do that? And I get the instinct to you hear this and you want to hear the other side of the story. But the difficulty is that, especially, for example, if you're dealing with child abuse, forensic investigators are trained to find out information without accidentally implanting information. So, asking questions so that you can get information without making suggestions to a child that they might say, oh yeah, I guess that's what happened. Yeah. Even if that wasn't what happened. And again, the more conversations children have had with other people, mom asks them about it, and then the pastor asks them about it, and then another elder checks with, the more non-professional interviews they've undergone, the more confused they're going to be, the less likely they're going to be, I've already talked about this 3 times. I don't want to talk about it again. So, from a standpoint of a solid and well done investigation, it's really important to call in the professionals right from the get-go. Grace, which is an organization that it stands for Godly Response to Abuse in a Christian Environment.
Yep.
They are extremely well equipped to handle situations like this. There are other third-party organizations that also can be called in, but the reason that it's really important when there are allegations of abuse to call in Grace early on. So I'm thinking, for example, there's an allegation against, say, a Sunday school teacher for inappropriate touching. Okay. The reason it's important to call in an organization early on for a couple of reasons. First of all, there's rarely only one victim. Mm-hmm. So if you've had a disclosure from one, there are almost certainly more. And those other victims need to know that this is being investigated so that they can come forward and share and corroborate the testimony. So, oftentimes something happens, something happens to a child or to a woman, and they're thinking, that was odd. That made me uncomfortable. I don't know if I should tell anyone. It was probably just me. I just misinterpreted it. Right. But then if there's a statement made, we are holding an investigation on this person for this kind of misbehavior, that gives other people an opportunity to say, okay, it wasn't just all in my head. Yeah. I had a similar experience. And it gives them, so oftentimes what Grace will do when they come into a church is they'll set up an email address. And so instead of, for example, the pastor saying, if anyone else has concerns, please contact me. Maybe the victims don't want to talk to the pastor about this. Maybe they don't want to talk to, other people who are peers with this Sunday school teacher or whatever.
Especially not if there's not a culture of this stuff. Why on earth would they ever want to talk to the pastor about it?
Right. Or if they've, tried to have conversations with people in the church before and weren't really heard. So, Grace can set up an email address so the church's message can be, if you have, and it doesn't have to only mean, if you've been abused, it could mean like, hey, the church secretary has noticed that this guy is in the building in odd hours with children, or, could just be any information that's relevant. Yeah. Then there's a safe place for them to share that information. And then also, a lot of times what happens is, the church will say, okay, we're launching an investigation on this person who is accused of doing this thing. It's going to bring up other related things. Like somebody might say, well, that guy never inappropriately touched me, but this guy did. And so, the problem begins to kind of expand, and you've got this spider web of stories being brought forward. So, that first allegation might seem like, okay, it's just a little problem. It's just this one thing, but you really could be looking at just the tip of the iceberg, which is why, getting an organization like Grace involved early enables them to do what they do best and, and receive those testimonies and those stories and help the church to think about what's the best way to proceed going forward. They're also going to be really good at helping churches to develop policies that are specifically going to relate to state laws. So, there are different laws in every state in terms of, for example, who are mandatory reporters. So clergy are not mandatory reporters in all states. Now, I think, we as Christians should hold ourselves to a higher standard than the law of the land.
It should be mandatory reporters. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. So I'm not suggesting that we limit ourselves to only doing what we have to do to fulfill.
But that should be the minimum. Yeah.
Yes, but it's still important to be informed. There are also state laws in some states. I think it's maybe about 14 states now that have laws about clergy sexual abuse. So, for example, if a doctor had a sexual relationship with a patient, if a therapist had a sexual relationship with a client, those would be considered abuse, regardless of whether, because of the power dynamic, because of the responsibility for protection and care. Any type of sexual relationship in the context of that professional relationship would be considered abuse. In 14 states, that kind of relationship between a pastor and a parishioner would also be considered abuse. So a lot of times what we hear is when a report comes out, well, this pastor's stepping down because he had an affair. If he is sleeping with a member of his congregation, that's abuse because he has a position of spiritual power and authority over that person. And so it's not the same as just two adults who, are sleeping with each other outside of marriage. There's an abuse of power that's happening in that situation. So again, these are all the kind of the details that could be that a organization like Grace could help a church to navigate, hopefully ahead of time. Because I think another thing that's important is if you just say, well, we've never really had a situation like that, so we'll just wait until something comes up and then we'll figure out what to do. Well, that's kind of like saying, we'll just wait until there's a house fire and then we'll teach the kids about like a good escape plan and to call 911 and all that. This is something you prepare for ahead of time so that when a situation like this does arise, and I say when, because statistics show us that 1 in 4, or sometimes 1 in 3, depending on which statistics you're looking at, 1 in 4 women will experience abuse at the hands of a domestic partner. So this is not like some random thing that rarely happens that most churches will probably never have to deal with. When a pastor's standing up at the front of his congregation on a Sunday morning and he looks out over that audience, he needs to be aware. This is not a theoretical, if he's going to talk about abuse or if he's going to talk about marriage or whatever. There's a significant demographic of his church that has already experienced this. And so, being aware of this and knowing, kind of what things should raise more questions, it's just something you have to do as a part of the responsibility of caring for human souls. One of the things that has never, ever made sense to me is the idea that, well, if he didn't hit her, if he didn't leave bruises, is that really abuse? It boggles my mind that a church would be more concerned with a woman's physical body than with the damage being done to her soul. Because isn't that really our purview, is caring for the soul and caring for, essentially the heresy that is perpetrated on an abuse victim by the things that her abuser tells her, often with, laced with scripture. You're my wife. You're supposed to submit. You're not being content. You have a bad attitude and you're emotional and I'm the leader. And, all of that is essentially, she's having heresy preached to her day in and day out, from the person who's supposed to care the most for her.
Yeah. Yeah, that leads me to my last question, which is why I left it for this, because I think it's going to be helpful for those listening, because this is not just a let's let our church order, our ecclesiastical structure figure this out. Let's not just do this in-house. That leads to a myriad of problems, like you just said. So, Donna, ending this out, how would you like to see counseling done, especially, I'm not saying that people shouldn't get counseling for a myriad of issues, but especially in cases of abuse, and that is both biblically informed, research-based, and attached to that question, how might churches become more trauma-informed and not scared of, like, oh, if we have all these secular ideologies floating on our church is definitely going to go liberal and definitely going to go woke and definitely go CRT, and they'll just go this avalanche of problems that they think is going to happen when this comes in, and that they can provide these kinds of resources for their members.
Well, Lena said that if she could offer one word of advice, it would be humility. And I think that's really where it starts. One of the reasons that churches might shy away from counseling is just because the whole realm of emotions is confusing. Another characteristic, I think, of Reformed churches is that we focus a whole lot on the mind and on the will. So that's reflected in the biblical counseling. The mind is, let's get you properly educated in your theology. And the will is, okay, now you just need to renounce this sin, repent, just be grateful to God for all the positive things. And we really don't touch on the realm of emotions at all. So it's a mysterious realm. It's not the forte of Reformed churches. And so I think the first thing is that humility for leadership to say, look at the abuse that's being reported across denominations. Can we really say, oh, no, we think we're immune to that? That's not going to happen here. And so you have to admit, this is really cross-cultural. So do we know what to do about this? Well, no, we really don't. We really don't have expertise on this. So that humility to say, we don't know what we don't know, we need to find out. And reaching out to some of these resources that Lena mentioned, like the local domestic abuse shelters, or to Grace, somewhere to get education. And I think it needs to start with the pastor and the session in a way that they can be instructed, but also have the opportunity to ask their questions, to make their objections, to really engage with the material. And then I think that having some general education for the congregation is good, some Sunday school classes maybe. And then a specific group, a team that can be kind of like first responders when there is maybe a hint that there's a problem, or particularly a team that's known, that's advertised that, hey, come talk to us if you're not sure what's going on. So this team would be also educated very specifically in how do we have these conversations? How do we have our antenna up to know what to listen for, what to follow up on? And so this team would be able to be a supportive place. I think in cases of abuse or other kinds of trauma, you still need the professional help. Mm-hmm. But a team like this in your church would be a spiritual support. So, yes, your counselor is helping you process this particular event in your life. And you need that specialized knowledge. But just like if you were physically ill, you have your spiritual support. Yes, we know it's hard. We're with you. We're going to stand with you. Look to God. He's walking with you. He's going to be with you through this process. So we each have a role to play.
Well, any final thoughts from Lynna and then from Donna about anything with what we talked about, or anything I missed, anything that you want listeners who are struggling and wrestling with this culture and the church that has been influenced by Doug and many others, and trying to figure out how do we do this better? How do we care? How is this not just a something that we are just worrying about this month when the series comes out, but something that we're actually implementing in the church and doing? So any final thoughts? I'll Lynna first and then Donna.
Yeah, I think one of the things, and this kind of touches on a lot of different angles, is the idea of people being created in God's image, and good learning, good education coming from many different angles, whether they be Christian or secular, resources that are available out there, both from secular and Christian authors. One of the things that really was kind of a light bulb moment for me, I had read a book written by a secular author. There were some things in it that I didn't agree with, but by and large, really helpful, very insightful information. And I was sharing with an elder that I really respect some of the things that I'd learned from that book, and he, was encouraged, was helped by that information. And he said, do you know of a resource that's like this, but it's written from a Christian perspective? Because I know I could never get my session to read this if it wasn't written from a Christian perspective. And what I felt in that moment was a little bit of anger. Like, you know what? I'm not theologically trained. I don't have a seminary degree. And yet I put on my big girl panties and I read this book and I considered the information in it. And I filtered it through my Christian worldview, which the church has trained me from a little girl to read. And I don't understand why ordained elders can't do the same thing and read these resources and consider and learn from many different sources. We don't have to be afraid. My pastor says, you can read this. Your God is big enough. Your Bible is big enough. It's okay. And the other aspect of this is, okay, if we're afraid to read, say a secular book on the dynamics of abuse, because wow, that would just require so much critical analysis and so much filtering.
Yeah, or it might expose our church too much, and we don't want our church to be exposed and this abuse to unravel everything we ever thought.
Well, so that attitude is honestly an infantilization of your members. The elders are capable of determining what's safe and not, but we can't trust our members to do that. We can't trust the women to read a book and decide what to believe and absorb. But another aspect of that is, so if we have to be afraid of things that are written by secular authors because, oh dear, it's going to require so much processing and filtering, does that mean that if we're reading something written by a Christian author that we're not analyzing and processing and filtering? If it's by, R.C. Sproul or Michael Horton or Dane Ortland, then, well, I can check my brain at the door and just absorb uncritically everything that I'm reading. Why is there that divide? Why are we not saying, Lord, give me wisdom to learn what you have me to learn from this Christian or secular author, and help me to think critically about the things that are not in line with what you teach? Because, here is this whole podcast series where we are talking about critically examining what we're getting from a branch of Christianity. So if we have to do that heavy lifting inside of our own circles, why are we not spiritually equipped to do that in the broader culture?
Good. Donna, any final thoughts?
To me, so much of the difficulty with sessions, churches, dealing with abuse goes back to this idea of policy. What are the steps we're supposed to take? Why can't we listen to this? Why do we have to silence this? And I think it's I think it's partly based in fear. I need a 5-step program. Otherwise, I'm not going to know what to do. And then that leads to a real legalism in dealing with issues. And I would just like to refocus on what Jesus said was the most important thing. Love the Lord your God. Love your neighbor as yourself. What if what this person is telling you really happened? What must that feel like? How would I want somebody to respond to me if I really was in that kind of distress? We don't have a set of rules for every situation, but we have a very strong principle for every situation, and that is to love our neighbors as ourselves.
I would like to thank Joyce Rowe for her vulnerability and courage to share what happened to her, as well as Lynna Sutherland and Donna Westcott to navigate some of the complexities of PCA and counseling. Lynna said something that you've heard me repeat, and I want to put it succinctly here. It's the fact that the PCA court system works that makes them particularly culpable when it doesn't. It's been thoroughly thought through and meticulously designed, albeit not with victims of abuse in mind. However, because it works for cases of theological dispute, it should work for those who come with accusations of abuse of all kinds. The easiest solution? Call for outside help. If it's serious and requires the civil courts, call your local officials. But that requires humility. It requires church officers who say, I can't handle this on my own. I shouldn't handle this on my own. I'm not equipped to handle this on my own. But I know who we can call. It requires understanding that Presbyterian polity only reaches so far and no further. It requires us knowing our limits, what we can and can't handle. When a Joyce Rowe comes our way, our first thought shouldn't be, how can we handle this in-house? How can we keep a lid on this? How can we continue smiling and fix this as quickly as possible? Our instinct should be, how can I help you? Let's bring in the proper authorities and experts, get you the counsel that you need, and move this further up the civil ladder as those authorities and experts see fit. It's not that churches don't have a role. It's that they should know their role and willingly partner with others who can help these women and men out. The church should be a beacon of hope for all, a place of the gospel of glory to shine brightly for those in high places and those who've been oppressed. It's all things for all people, not just the powerful or the lowly, but everyone in between. Next week, we've got a special. You're not going to want to miss it, especially if you're in the OPC. See you then.